a bias is a pattern,
Right.
right? And we as human beings, we're pattern makers, but we're also pattern changers, and we can change those patterns.
Hi, I'm Brilliant, your host for this show. I know that I'm incredibly blessed. As the son of self-made billionaires, I've seen the high price some people pay for success, and I've learned that money really can't buy happiness. But I've also had the good fortune to learn directly from many of the world's leading teachers. If you're ready to be, do, have, and give more, this podcast is for you. If you are a leader, if you aspire to be a leader, if you just want to be a better human being, I think you'll enjoy and probably be challenged by my guest today. Her name is Kim Scott. She's written a few books, some you might have heard of, maybe even read. Radical Candor. That's a book that gives some very useful perspectives on how to give feedback, how to receive feedback. And her latest book is one called Just Work: How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Build a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity. This is a book that challenged me, but a little more about that soon. Kim was a CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and other tech companies. She was a member of the faculty at Apple University, and before that led teams at Google, including AdSense. She also managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. That is pretty incredible experience. So Kim is one whom I really admire because she's not just writing from theory, but from deep experience. So in this interview, we talk about some of the different roles that we play as we go through life and in the workplace. We talk about what it means, what to do when you are the person harmed, when you are the person who caused harm, when you're in a leadership position, or if you are an upstander, someone who observes this, and what your responsibility is or might be and how to effectively handle this. I took a lot away from this. I hope you do as well. You can learn more about Kim and her work on the web by visiting radicalcandor.com. You can also visit justworktogether.com, and you can find Kim on Twitter at Kimball Scott. Please take this, use it to make the world a better place, whatever your tiny corner of the world is. And I'll do the best to do the same in mine. So please enjoy this conversation with my friend, Kim Scott. Kim, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the School for Good Living.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for all the great work that you do.
Will you tell me, please, what is life about?
To me, I mean, who knows is the TLDR, but for me, life is about becoming your best self. It's about turning the things that are in your imagination into realities. That's what it is partly about, but it's also about doing that with other people, and allowing other people to enter your imagination and to change your imagination, depending on to meld your dreams with their dreams.
I love it. I'm looking forward to where this is going to go. Well, maybe I can start with this idea of working with other people and imagination and sharing and being shared with. Maybe I want to start with paper airplanes.
Okay.
I understand there was a time when you were involved in a company that involved paper airplanes in some form or fashion, and you print them and they'd be sent. How did this go? What is this?
There were, we tried to liven things up. We would try to have 5 minutes of fun every day. And because I found, and a lot of other people found, about 2 or 3 o'clock, energy would start to flag. And so for a while we would play music, we would dance around, but then we started throwing paper airplanes, and we would even get those like Nerf guns, and they were Nerf rockets, actually, is what they were. They were like a Nerf thing on a rubber band that you would shoot at people. And it just livened things. It livened life up. It reminded us not to take ourselves too seriously.
But with these rockets and these airplanes, Sergio did tell me something as well about stuffed snakes and about celebrating failures as well as successes.
Yes. So one of the best things that I did to build a culture of radical candor on the team at Google was we had an all hands meeting when I was managing the AdSense team. It was about, 115 people. And so we would all get together once a week. And early on, I brought a stuffed daisy. There was a stuffed daisy. Whoops, a daisy. It actually wasn't a daisy. It was something else. I'll tell you, that's a longer story. But let's just say for here, it was a stuffed daisy. And I brought a stuffed golden retriever. And so 2 stuffies. And the stuffed daisy, you would nominate yourself for Whoops, a daisy. And so if you screwed up something that week, you'd say, I screwed up, and you'd raise your hand and you'd tell the story. And the deal was you'd get instant forgiveness, but you'd also help all your colleagues not make the same mistake. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of a part of building a culture in which self-criticism was safe and therefore and viewed as a gift to others. And therefore it became easier for us to criticize each other as well as but very strict rule with whoops. You could only nominate yourself for whoops. And then for the stuffed golden retriever, the idea was that when you saw someone on your team do something fantastic, do something really great, you would nominate them for the stuffed golden retriever. And this had the impact, people are reluctant to give each other praise because it can sound patronizing. And it just reminded us that it's important to take a minute to do that, to praise each other and to do that publicly. And it's really interesting. There's an interesting study I read about that said that when movie critics panned the movie, people thought they were smarter than when they loved the movie. Mm. And I think this, if you're not careful in an organization, that can kind of take hold where people try to sort of criticize one another to look smart, and that you don't want. So those were 2 important things. I had to put $20 on top of Whoops, a daisy, because people didn't really want to criticize themselves. And I don't think that people started telling the stories on themselves just because they needed the $20, but it kind of gave them, plausible deniability. They were just playing along.
Yeah. Now, what a great way to make it safe to acknowledge something that's less than perfect and to help others learn in the process.
And to make, you want to make failure safe. You want to develop a growth mindset on the team where it's good to make mistakes because we learn from them. It's, we're not going to innovate if we're not making mistakes. And so that was a big part of the reason for doing that.
Yeah. Well, and what you're speaking to as well, this whole idea of, people who maybe are critical of others to look smarter. What's this cognitive bias that I come across every now and then again, but people who are kinder are perceived to be less competent.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I know there's a name for that in the leadership psychology. I'm not thinking of it now.
Well, when it comes to gender, people call that the competence likability bias.
That's it. So
very often, in particular, a woman who is competent is viewed as unlikable, which is that's kind of rough.
Yeah. Why is that? Why do you think that? I mean, is this a cultural thing? Is this pretty universal around the world? Have you found, or what's your understanding of this?
Of the competence likability bias?
Yeah.
Well, I think as it pertains to women, I think there's a reluctance to see women in leadership positions. There's, and so when things surprise us, we tend to reject them. I think if you read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, there's a lot of examples of that happening. Bias kind of reflects and reinforces these stereotypes that are kind of in the air. And so it's really important. One of the things that I spend a lot of time on in my book, Just Work, is disrupting those biases. And there's all different kinds of biases. There's racial biases, there's gender biases, there's biases around sight, around, like, for example, something that I used to say all the time, which reflects a bias, is, oh, that's lame. why would I say that? Why would I have sort of a negative connotation with a person who can't walk like that? So choosing different words and learning to flag these biases is really, I think, important for all of us to make sure that a bias is a pattern, right? And we as human beings, we're pattern makers, but we're also pattern changers, and we can change those patterns.
Yeah. What's your take on this whole thing about those who say, like, we're just so sensitive now? Like everybody, yes, words matter. On the one hand, I don't think there's very many people that would dispute that words actually do matter.
Yeah.
And there's and I'm related to some of them. I love some of them very much, but I also think there's this view about, come on, you're a snowflake, or you're just being soft, or it doesn't actually matter that much what you're saying right now.
Yeah. There's Russ Laraway, who I worked with at Google and who I started a company with, and who went on to lead the people operations team at Qualtrics. He has a really good response to that. There was one time when I tweeted something and I said something like, "Tell me why I'm crazy." And someone tweeted at me and said, that's really offensive to people who struggle with mental illness. And I understood why, and I agreed. And I said, yeah, there's no reason for me to use a sloppy metaphor like that. Tell me why I'm wrong. That's what I really meant.
Right.
And then there was a bunch of people who piled on and said, oh, we're all oversensitive, you didn't do anything wrong, Kim. And then Russ, and that put me in a slightly tricky situation, because as a woman, I often get, accused of being oversensitive or whatever. And then Russ jumped in and he said, look, for the you're too sensitive crowd, let me explain the ROI of changing the words you're using. And he said, the investment is very small. You just change the word and you're usually using a better word. And the return is huge. A, you're communicating better because you're being more precise, but B, you're working better with a whole host of people. You're able to recruit from a bigger group of people. You're able to promote from a bigger group of people. You're able to bring out the best in the people that you hire. He said, that's a really positive ROI. Why wouldn't you just change the. And then he told me recently something else that I really liked about this. Someone had used a word that offended someone else at work. I don't remember what it was. And was told not to use that word anymore. And he said, I'm just being myself. I'm just being my authentic self. and Russ looked at him and he said, you know what? I'm pretty sure that using the word blah is nowhere on the top 100 things of who you are. Who you are is you're a good leader. You're a good person. You care about being productive. Like, this is unproductive. Don't use the word. So I guess those are a few things. I'm going to quote Russ for the I'm too sensitive crowd, because I liked what he had to say.
I love that view about the cost is so minimal, but the benefits can be huge.
Yeah, but I will say I've been guilty of saying that myself. When I wrote Just Work, I obviously wanted to make sure that I was not using biased language. And so I hired someone who I called my bias buster. And so this person read the book and sort of identified some things that I had said that were problematic. And there were 8 words that I tended to use in ways that were problematic. And my initial instinct was, no word is safe in the English language. And then so quantify your bias. Then I took a step back and I'm like, okay, those are 8 words. How many words are there in the English language? I think 250,000, something like that. There were plenty of safe words in English. So it's worth taking the time to think about what we really mean when we say what we say.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that even it's kind of, for me, a little bit like the, Dweck's fixed mindset and the growth mindset of where consciously choosing to orient ourselves toward something like growth, of saying, look, I might be wrong. I'm open to a possibility. And not just in the way we speak, but in the way we live.
Yeah.
Right? Like I had an example of this where I went to an event in Washington, D.C. before the pandemic. So in modern times, this was forever ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Another world away.
yeah, they had, the organizers had chosen, on the upper level was the bathrooms were as they were. But on the lower level, they covered over the sign. It was like unisex or universal, whatever, bathroom. And I didn't know that. I just saw the toilet sign and I went in, and then I realized I was in the women's bathroom because there were no urinals.
Yeah.
And at first it was a little strange just because it was not usual for me.
Yeah.
And then there was a woman in the bathroom using the bathroom while I was there. And I went ahead and used it. And it really, for me, was one of those moments that when I woke up that morning, I didn't expect to encounter a situation like that.
Yeah.
But it caused me to start to go, well, yeah, why do we differentiate? I mean, we don't at home.
Yeah. My husband and I share a bathroom.
Yeah. And it's not strange. And I kind of thought that maybe that was just one of many examples that I'm ignorant of, that my life might actually be enhanced by an awareness of and embracing of something that's not familiar or comfortable or whatever. So I don't know if that makes sense there, kind of the line that I'm following, but this whole thing about that is not a sensitivity, that the investment might actually be pretty small. The return of inclusion or performance could be massive.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
But your thing too about hiring this bias buster, I really admire that, because I wrote a manuscript a couple years ago and I had an editor edit it. And one of the examples she gave me was committed suicide. And she changed it to died by suicide.
Yeah.
So I started paying attention to that. And I realized there's a lot of journalists at publications I respect that are still using committed suicide.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting to me that, and another one for me was I didn't get sexual preference versus sexual orientation.
Yes.
Right. And that's a pretty big implication.
Huge.
Yeah. So the kinds of things that we use without really thinking about it that actually do represent a system, a pattern of belief and behavior that we can then modify. It's pretty remarkable. But the fact that you wrote an entire book, open yourself up to that deliberately in the drafting process, like I really admire you for that.
Well, I would have been probably the world's biggest hypocrite if I hadn't been open to it, since I was writing about that topic. But I want to come back to something you said that I think is so important about having a growth mindset. Like I have worked with almost nobody who really wants to be biased, who that's their goal. That's usually not the goal. And if they want that, then we're talking about prejudice, not bias anyway. And so I think part of the problem is that, it's hard to have a growth mindset about math. It's a little hard to say, oh, I got this question wrong. Yay. It's an opportunity to learn something. That's a big mind shift in and of itself. But if you think about applying a growth mindset to who we are as human beings, it almost feels like sometimes applying a growth mindset to my ethics or my morality. Like I'm never as good a person as I aspire to be. Right. And learning how to become the person I want to be means I have to be willing to notice when I have failed to live up to the person who I want to be. Yeah. And I think that applying a growth mindset to becoming the human beings we want to be is vital, but it's also much harder, because I don't know about you, but sometimes when someone points out a bias that I have, I feel like, I've revealed something horrible about myself. And, it's like the fly to my soul has come undone or something.
Yeah, it's a good description.
And that's that's a scary feeling. So learning how to move through that shame, I think is really important to becoming the people who we want to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's kind of like the Matthew McConaughey acceptance speech of who's your hero, my 10-year future self.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. So with this most recent book, Just Work, How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Build a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity. You started this before the pandemic.
Yeah, before me too, actually. Before Harvey Weinstein's story broke.
It's been a work in progress for a while. Why did you choose to write this book?
Shortly after I published Radical Candor, I was giving a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person I like and respect enormously, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And after I gave the talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm really excited to roll out Radical Candor on the team. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she explained to me that as soon as she would offer someone even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, I had 4 different revelations at the same time. The first was that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagine myself to be, that I want to be. I'd not been an upstander. I'd failed even to notice the extent to which she had always had to show up unfailingly pleasant and cheerful at every meeting we had ever been in together. And believe me, she had what to be ticked off about in her in that period of time, as we all do at work. The second thing that I realized was that I had been in denial about the kinds of things that happened to me as a woman in the workplace. Hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit I had been in denial, but I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. So I had gone through a lot of my career just pretending that things that were happening weren't happening. And then, but even less than wanting to ever think of myself as a victim, did I want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And yet I had been even deeper in denial about the kinds of things that I had done to others I never meant to harm other people who I work with, but I had done it. And then the fourth thing that I realized that as a leader, I always prided myself in, creating these BS-free zones. But I realized that I had failed to create the kind of environment that would specifically identify and eliminate bias, prejudice, and bullying, because I had, you can't solve problems if you refuse to notice them. So it was a mind-blowing moment, but I think that was the moment when I sort of decided that Just Work was the next book I had to write.
Wow. Who do you hope reads and applies what you have to say in this book?
Yeah, this is never a satisfying answer for people, but I did write it with 4 different audiences in mind, which I know is kind of a no-no, but I did it anyway. The first is for leaders.
At least it wasn't everyone.
No, it's not everyone, but 4 distinct audiences. Okay. But these are the people who need to work together to solve this problem. So the first is for leaders. I get very detailed about things that leaders can and should do to address the problem of workplace injustice. But I also wrote it for upstanders, because the people who observe this nonsense are often in a better place to respond to it than either the leader or the person who is harmed by it. So I want to encourage people not to be silent bystanders, but to be upstanders. And then I also wrote it for people who are harmed by these problematic attitudes and behaviors, because I want to arm them with a way to choose a response. And last but not least, I wrote it also for people who cause harm, because we all are bound to mess up from time to time. And so how can we learn to make sure that we listen to the feedback and address the problems that we change when we need to change? So that's who I wrote this. And I centered it on the workplace because that's where most of us spend, at least before the pandemic, most of our time. And even though I'm not in a workplace now, I'm working all day long. But I think that the workplace is the place where we really can create and change rules quickly. Right. I think we can do it and must do it at a societal level as well. But I think we can all create a better place where we spend our days, and should.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with what we're seeing with the Great Resignation, and just, I mean, all the factors in the world right now of people not wanting to go back to the office. Many people, some people do.
Yeah.
And it's clearly benefits, but some people just leaving the workplace before they had probably planned to. Other people not wanting to coming back, but not wanting to come back. People wanting to be paid more. This wanting to just change the experience of it. And I think at the root of all of this is my own take. I'd love your view on this, but I think, although this isn't true for everyone, of course, that the level of prosperity globally, even though there's a lot of people, billions of people still without water or sanitation and things like that, and a lot of people in our country that still don't have a great standard of living, that nevertheless, the material prosperity on the planet is higher than ever before.
Yeah.
But what we're all looking for, especially after a certain level of comfort is achieved and security, is meaning.
Yeah.
And we're craving that. And we're not going to feel satisfied if we're part of a system or a group that we know is inherently unjust.
Yeah.
Right. So until we achieve the kinds of workplaces that you're talking about, we're going to keep drifting or keep searching for something else, even if the money is there, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think we also need to sort of re-examine the way that we pay people. I think the people at the top pay themselves too much and pay rank and file employees too little. We really need to take a hard look at that.
Yeah, well, historically, and I'm not a historian, but the little bit I know, it's never ended well when there was this disparity.
No, it does not end well.
So,
in fact, we're seeing how that ends tragically right now in Russia.
Yeah. So, okay, let me ask you this. I want to ask you a little bit about some of the frameworks that you've created in this book, and I appreciate that because I think it makes it easier to understand, to share with others, to apply. But how did you think about the creation of frameworks as you drafted this book? And what were maybe one or two that actually seem really central, or they've been really, really helpful in your disseminating these ideas with others?
So as I started writing Just Work, I always want to come up with a 2x2, and there is a 2x2. I love a good 2x2 framework. But for me, the thing that really helped, the thing as I wrote and really tried to make sense of my own experiences and the experiences of others, the thing that really helped me was beginning to disentangle bias, prejudice, and bullying, and to offer really simple definitions and simple responses, because I think very often we conflate these things as though they're one. But bias is very different from prejudice, is very different from bullying. And so to me, bias is not meaning it. It's kind of a brain hiccup. Whereas prejudice is meaning it. It's a very consciously held belief. And bullying is just being mean. And all of a sudden, when I had this kind of simple framework to in the moment, and you don't have to be sure what it is, but for me to think, what do I think this is? Then I knew how to respond, because I think if it's bias, you want to respond with an I statement, which kind of invites the other person in to understand things from your perspective. It sort of holds up a mirror. But if it's prejudice, and so an example of an I statement, by the way, is I don't think you meant that the way it sounded, or it doesn't have to be a very very confrontational statement, but prejudice demands a different response, because if you hold up a mirror to prejudice, the person's going to say, yeah, they're going to like what they see. And so there you need an it statement. And an it statement draws a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they're not allowed to impose that belief on another person. And so an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to sort of common sense. So
it's not okay to say that kind of thing here.
Yeah, it's not okay, or it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate, because of their hair or whatever. But it's also an HR violation not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. And it's also, at least in California, illegal not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. So you want to make sure that you're appealing to this boundary that is sort of generally understood. But if it's bullying, there's no belief, conscious or unconscious, in operations, the person just acting like a jerk and trying to cause harm, you want to use a you statement. And my daughter actually explained this to me when she was in third grade. She was getting bullied and I was encouraging her to use an I statement. I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? And I thought, you know what? That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And so we talked about saying, you know, you can't talk to me like that, or you can't do that, or you need to stop now, or what's going on for you? Why are you doing this? And that, you know, now she was not in the subordinate role, you know, she was playing an active role and sort of pushing, if an I statement invites a person in, a you statement sort of pushes them away.
So did she end up doing that with this bully, and did it work? Do you know how that?
She did do it, and it helped. I mean, you know, it. What really you need with bully is you need the teacher, or at work you need the manager to create consequences for that bullying.
Yeah.
And there need to be sort of conversational consequences in the moment. There need to be in the workplace sort of compensation consequences. You don't want to give the highest ratings and the biggest bonuses to the bullies. And there have to be career consequences. Like I find with a lot of the companies that I've worked with, there's a moment in their growth when the jerks begin to win. And that's the moment when the company's culture begins to fail. So you need to make sure, I think, especially in the case of bullying, you need leaders to play a role, but you also need upstanders to play a role, to intervene. And were you going to say something?
No, I was just saying that I totally agree with upstander. And that was a term that I hadn't really heard. I think Starbucks had done a series called that or something, but before this, about the 4 different roles, because that's another framework, right?
Yeah.
That matters to know which is happening. So I love that. Bias, bullying, bias, prejudice, or bullying, and then what role are we in?
Yeah.
It's so helpful.
Yeah. But it gets complicated, right? Because there's 4 roles and 3 things. And then the 3 things can get worse once you layer power on. But it's not that complicated. Like we can wrap our mind around this.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of a little, and this might not be a perfect analogy, but I went through a period of time in my life where I played a lot of Monopoly. I loved that board game. And I went so far as I bought a book. There's a book called The Monopoly Companion, and it's like 200 pages on Monopoly. And
wow.
It goes through history and all this. And it points out certain things, like, you know, which properties are landed on statistically the highest and which has the highest return, and stuff that once it's pointed out to you,
yeah.
Like, oh, I get it.
Yeah. It's obvious. Now I know what to do.
But before, you're just like kind of playing the game as best you can and hoping something good happens or not too bad. But that's one thing. And then the other thing is I hear you share this, and it reminds me, I interviewed someone named Stephen Cope, who's a spiritual teacher back East. And when I asked him his opinion, or asked him to tell me what is life about, and I think about this a lot. He said that it's about becoming, in the Hindu tradition, what's called a Jivan Mukti, the soul awake in this lifetime.
Yes.
Right. And what you're saying, what I'm hearing now is like to be aware, like, oh my goodness, this is a bully and this is what's called for. It's you. Right. Yeah. Or, hey, I think this might be prejudice. And I love your formulation. And you just said most of it here about, I don't think you meant what you said. Let me tell you how I heard it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like very generous. And it's different. And why I say like the soul awake in this lifetime is to be present, to be responsive or responsible. Like there's a lot in this that for me, maybe that's just my orientation, that there's actually, I think, some spiritual work here if we're willing to see it that way or take it on that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you, because it's so, another way of saying something similar, Kimberly Crenshaw said, if you can't name it, you can't fix it. And giving things names can really help us be more aware of them.
Yeah.
And I think especially when there's these patterns that happen over and over again, and it's easy in some ways, fighting gaslighting is another way of saying, I want to be aware. I want to be present, because I don't want to be confused. I want to see things as they really are. I want to notice things. I'm going to wave. One of the things I recommend is bias disruption. And I use a purple flag. And every time I say something biased, I'm going to wave a purple flag. So I just said, you see. And what I meant was you notice. And this is one of the words that my bias buster told me about.
This is one of the 8.
Yeah, said you often use sloppy sight metaphors, and it's sort of ableist. And I knew that this was right because I don't mean see, I mean notice and or understand, or and it's useful to stop and think about what I really mean. And the reason why it's problematic is that it kind of implies that if you can't see, you might not notice these things. And in fact, one of the people who was helping me edit the book is a historian who's blind. And he's one of the most clear thinkers I've ever met in my whole life. And so I thought I understood it. I thought I agreed. I thought I had stopped using sloppy sight metaphors. And yet I did a quick search of the document before I sent the final version to my editor. And in a 350-page book, guess how many times I had used sloppy sight metaphors?
57.
99.
Wow.
99. Yeah. It's every third page. It was unbelievable. And I was conscious. I thought I was enlightened, but I was not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's like I had the chance to do a motorcycle riding school once, and the instructor would ride behind us and he would film us. Mm-hmm. One of the goals most of the students had, including me, was to put our knee down. Like if you lean that far, you're like the pros. And I'm like, oh man, on turn 3, I was so close. I must have been half an inch. And we come back and I'm like that far. I'm like, I'm not even close.
Yeah. Yeah. The way we perceive things is often not how they really are.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt about that. Okay. I do want to ask you about this, I really appreciate something you write in this book where you talk about, silence, and you talk about it as a default. And then you also talk about conflict as maybe a reason sometimes it's the reason for our silence. But I know there's not necessarily, I haven't put a clear question out there yet, but will you talk about silence? Will you talk about defaults? And will you talk about conflict and benefits, drawbacks?
Yeah. Absolutely. So one of the things that I learned in tech is the power of the default. And a lot of people have written about this. For a long time, the default on your driver's license is I'm not an organ donor. Mm-hmm. And then when the default is, you are, unless you opt out, then you have way more, it's tragic, obviously, that there are so many organ donors, but at least you have benefited someone. And so I wanted to think about one of the things that became clear to me as I was writing Just Work is the number of times in my career where something really bad happened to me or happened to someone else I cared about, when there was some sort of injustice, and my default position was always to remain silent, not to speak up about it. And I really wanted to think about, why is that? What's the default to silence? And I think part of the reason why we default to silence is that we're so aware of the risks and costs of speaking up. It feels very risky. We're less aware of the risks of remaining silent. And for me, at least, one of the bad things that happened as a result of defaulting to silence was that I felt like I was losing a sense of agency. Mm-hmm. And I also felt like I wasn't becoming the person I wanted to be. And I felt like kind of a wimp. And it was so it was really important to me in the book to encourage people to make a choice to respond or not to respond. And when you're the person who's harmed, if you're the upstander, you don't have a choice. You must intervene. But if you're harmed, you do get a choice. You can choose your battles. But you want to make that a conscious choice that you own, rather than one that is imposed upon you by default, I think.
Yeah. There's power. There's huge power in choice.
Yes.
All right.
And in recognizing that you have a choice that sometimes you don't necessarily feel like you have.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Okay. Just to keep us on pace here, I want to move us through into the lightning round. But before I do, I want to ask, I know there's so much in this book. It's a long book, by the way.
Yeah, it was. It's a long book, and it's definitely, it was hard to write, and people have told me it was hard to read. So feel free to read it, a chapter at a time.
Yeah, what I would do is I got the Audible and I would read it, usually while I was on the elliptical, 30 minutes at a time. And I just, honestly, for me, because I'm not currently in a leadership position, leadership of people, but I thought, man, this is a huge undertaking. I used to wonder why more people didn't aspire to be entrepreneurs or to be leaders or managers. And now I think I get a little more like, it's not just, it's status or it's income, but if you really take it on as the responsibility that it is, it's pretty massive. So I would finish reading it going, man, I'm afraid that if I was in a leadership position right now, I'd be doing it wrong.
Well, look, I did it wrong, as you could tell from the stories I told in the book. I certainly got it wrong more often than I got it right.
Well, man, one of the other things that really stood out to me was some of the stories you tell from your own experience. I could hardly believe. I would tell them to my wife about, there was a time when you were working overseas and you were told there wasn't a toilet available for you.
Yes. Yeah. And that I had to pee in a mop closet.
That is remarkable.
Yeah, it really did happen. Yeah, it was remarkable. It was really pretty shocking.
Well, I learned some new words.
Yeah.
You had some things happen to you that I didn't even know they were a thing. I
didn't know it was a word either, actually. You're talking about frauding.
Yeah. I had to consult the Urban Dictionary and look online.
Yeah. No, I Googled what had happened and found there was a word for it. Who knew,
Well, and some of the other things like that, space flight. And I know for the listener, there's almost no context here aside from various incidents of, some of them were bullying. Some of them were, assault.
Sexual harassment, sexual assault.
It's remarkable to me that you had so many. And then for me to realize that's not unusual. I talked to my wife. She was a professional for many, many years. She's like, oh yeah, that kind of stuff happened to me. People saying and doing things like that to me. I'm like, that is not right. Yeah.
No, it is not right. And remember, I was writing this book from a position of privilege. Imagine, if I didn't have, the privileges that I have. It's much, much worse for many other people than it was for me. And that was the thing. You said you're surprised one person. I was surprised I had that many stories. I had been so deep in denial when I started the book. I thought, I have a couple of stories, but I'll have to do research and interview other people. And I'm like, oh my goodness, now that I think about it, I have enough stories for 6 books.
What's it been like? I mean, I just know you a little bit from seeing your work online. And I think I told you before the interview that I was part of an EO, an entrepreneurs organization group that you addressed, which I got a lot out of. I enjoyed. But so I have some sense of your style. You're pretty open, it seems. You're pretty warm. I think you come across to me as very smart. But to be so personal, right? Because there's a lot of people that teach this that are more, academic or less personal. What's it been like for you to share so openly from your experience? How does that make it? How's it been received, or what's that been like?
It was when I started writing, growing up, I always wrote a journal. I always wrote in a journal every day. And when I started writing this book, I almost kind of went into that headspace as though I was writing it just for myself. And I will confess to you that about a month before it was due to be published, I was like, oh my gosh, why did I tell all those stories publicly? I had a real moment of panic. And another guy who was on the team that I led at Google read it, and he sent me a note. He said, I hope you're not having a vulnerability hangover. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I was having a vulnerability hangover. I had really, I told a bunch of stories, but at the same time, it was sort of liberating. There were several moments when I was writing the book where I realized I've been carrying this thing around that I didn't know I was carrying around. And now that I've articulated it, I can put it down. And so it was liberating as well as scary.
That's great. Yeah, I think of that to this personal moment in the podcast here, but I think this is part of where I've been really hung up in getting my own book across the finish line to be something that's published. Because it's one thing if it's like, I know, people like
Jung or many others will say, hey, 100 years after my death, you can publish this. But when the other people, even when you anonymize them or aggregate, it's like, there's people alive. They're going to read it. They're going to know.
Yeah.
And hopefully it will reach and serve a lot more than that. But I would imagine that's got to be challenging. But I would.
Yeah. I think one of my failures as a person is that I often don't imagine before I'm in the situation what it's going to be like. So I probably should have been more aware and more afraid as I was writing, but I wasn't until right before it came out. It was sort of like one time I went to trapeze school, and it just didn't occur to me until I was 2/3 of the way up the ladder that how high I was climbing and how afraid I would feel. And then I just had no choice but to keep going.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe not a bad thing.
Yeah, maybe.
Right. Okay. Well, okay. With that, then what I want to ask is this, what haven't we talked about that you want to talk about or you think would be of service to the listener, knowing that we're about to move on to the enlightening lightning round and writing and creativity?
Yeah. I think that we need to talk for a moment about power and how much worse power makes all of these things. So when you have bias or prejudice plus power, you're creating the conditions for discrimination. When you have bullying plus power, you're creating the conditions for real harassment. And when you have physical touch plus power, whether it's sort of physical power or positional power, you created the conditions for physical violations or even physical violence. And there's tons more to say about this, but we really need to make sure that we're rigorous about creating checks and balances in the systems that we create at work and also in the world, in political life as well as in business life, because otherwise, if we don't consciously design the systems that govern our institutions for justice, we're going to get systemic injustice. So tons more to say about that, but power is a real problem. And if one of the biggest mistakes that I made in my career happened because I sort of imagined, well, if I were in charge, everything will be sweetness and light, right? Bad things won't happen, and they will happen when you're in charge, even no matter how good your intentions are. So you really want to make sure that that you place checks and balances on yourself as a leader.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think this is an example, maybe you can tell me because it's an example from your book, but you talk about one place where you worked that no single individual could make a hiring decision or even a promotion decision.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that the kind of example that you're talking about?
That's exactly. So when I first got to Google, and I want to say that Google was not perfect, and a lot of people had terrible experiences at Google. But I will say that one of the things that I think they did right, that Shona Brown, who led business operations at Google, did right, was create systems where if you didn't like your boss, you could move to another team. Because, we know that people join companies, but they leave bosses. And they didn't want to lose people. So they're like, if you don't like your boss, you can find another boss. You're free to do it. No boss could unilaterally hire someone. You had to go through it. No boss could unilaterally promote someone. No boss could unilaterally fire someone. No boss could unilaterally decide on someone's bonus. And so they very consciously stripped the usual sources of power that managers have away from managers. And that created a much better environment for innovation, but also, for workplace, to avoid bias, prejudice, bullying.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the enlightening lightning round, again, this is a series of questions on a variety of topics. My aim, for the most part, is to ask the question and then be quiet. You're welcome to answer as long as you want. I might tug on a response here or there, but okay. Question number 1, please complete the following sentence with something other than a box of chocolates.
Okay.
Life is like a blank.
Blank canvas.
Okay. Question number 2. Here I'm borrowing one of Peter Thiel's questions. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
The important truth that very few people agree with me on is that we should really dramatically limit income inequality and wealth inequality in the country, dramatically. No one should ever have more than $100 million, period.
Okay. Question number 3. If you were required every day for the rest of your life to wear a t-shirt with a slogan on it or a phrase or a saying or a quote or a quip, what would the shirt say?
Radical candor.
All right. Question number 4. What book other than one of your own have you gifted or recommended most often?
Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
That is probably won't surprise you, but that is the most common response to this question. Over like 150 interviews, I'll bet it's come up close to a third of the time.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, it is a remarkable book.
Yeah, it is. It's the kind of book that many people read many times in their life. What's your relationship with this book been like?
It's interesting. I read that book shortly after September 11th. I remember I went to a conference. I went to the TED conference. And I was so sort of devastated by what had happened. I just remember going back up to my hotel room and spending the whole afternoon reading it. And the thing that is so inspiring about that book for me is just remembering that no matter what happens, you get to choose how you respond, and that's where your freedom is. And he was writing that from concentration camps, of course. So I've never, I have lived a very very comfortable life by and large, and so that's really, I think, meaningful to me about that book. I also love I think it was it might have been something else he wrote, but I'm pretty sure it was in Man's Search for Meaning, when he was trying to decide whether he should leave Germany. And a temple had been destroyed, and he walked by it and he bent down and picked up a fragment of stone, and it said, "Honor thy father and thy mother." And so he decided he had to stay because he couldn't get his parents out. Wow. And I just thought that was I think about that all the time.
Remarkable. What are you currently reading?
I am currently reading a bunch of books about the most recent one was American Kleptocracy, and I'm going to pull up the title because I can never remember exactly what the title, but it's Moneyland. I'm reading a book called Moneyland about how we have got to get our the way that we allow people to hide their money. We got to stop it. It's what funded, I think, Putin's war.
Yeah, and with crypto now, it's probably harder than ever.
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. Thank you for that. All right, question number 5. So you travel a lot, I would imagine.
I used to travel a lot.
The days before the pandemic?
No, not even before the pandemic. Since I had kids, I really hate leaving them. And so I do not travel in the last, they're 13 now. So in the last 13 years, I have traveled a lot less.
Oh, okay. Well, that answers the question. No, it was a question about travel being when you travel, what's something you do to make it less painful or more enjoyable?
Oh, I can tell you when I do, I listen to books on Audible and play 2048. Which it allows me to block out everything on, if I'm standing in line, I'm still listening to the book, but I need the 2048 is just one of those silly games that you're making numbers go down, and
I don't know this.
It's kind of like Tetris. There's another game like it that's called Threes.
Okay. And it's kind of where you match and it consolidates.
Yeah. And then the numbers add up and you try to try to get as big a number as possible.
All right. Question number 6. What's something you've started or stopped doing in order to live or age well?
Stopped drinking. I stopped drinking alcohol. And I started, instead of running, I started walking.
Good for you.
Yeah.
I love to walk.
I love to walk. It's great. And my back was always hurting. And I feel younger now because my back doesn't always hurt anymore. So
That's wonderful. Just on that topic, I had this idea talking about unexamined assumptions, that the natural course of life was just to get old, to get sick, and to die. And then I was reading a spiritual teacher, an Indian teacher, Yogananda, and he gave the analogy of aging like a fruit ripens, and then you just fall from the tree. But that totally open, like we don't have to get sick. That doesn't have to be a step.
Yes.
So
I love that. Okay. Falling from the tree. That's the way I'm going to think about it. I like it.
Ripe all the way.
Ripening.
Yeah. Okay. Question number 7. And even this might be one of these things a bias buster would point out for me, because I'm using the word American here, or maybe I should say United States citizen. But what's one thing you wish every American knew?
I wish every American knew more about slavery and the ways in which it corrupted our country.
Okay. I feel like I should ask more about that, but is there anything more you'd say knowing we're in the lightning round?
The trauma of slavery. I mean, the fact that people still vacation at places that are called plantations. I mean, what they really were was forced labor camps. Why would you, I'm going to go to a vacation at a forced labor camp. Like, I feel like we just have not at all come to grips with the ways that slavery then impacted our incarceration system, the ways in which our laws around who lives where are, I think we have this tendency, going back to your thoughts about a growth mindset, to assume that was there. Mm-hmm. And I think when it comes, certainly I grew up in Memphis and I live in California. And there's this attitude that, racism is in Memphis, not in California. Whereas recently I was at home in Memphis and there were a number of Black Lives Matter signs in the yards and they were there and staying there. Whereas when I in California put a Black Lives Matter up in my yard, it gets once a week, it gets stolen. I have to keep buying them. So I think we're not as aware as we should be of the ways that the sort of original sin of our country is still with us today, and we haven't done enough to atone for it.
Yeah, I think you're right. All right, thank you for that. Question number 8. This one's about relationships. What's the most important or useful thing you've learned about making relationships work?
I think it's so important to spend time every day with the people who you love. It's there's just nothing. This is one of the things in the pandemic that I realized. I realized that, when the kids were here, I was all day, every day, which they do not need to be for their own sake. But I realized it was disruptive, and I was taking kind of like a 30% productivity hit at work, but I was getting a 60% parenting gain. And it was a great trade-off. And I realized, I used to talk when in Radical Candor, I write a lot about how important it is to have these conversations in person. And it is important to get together in person with the people who you work with, but it's way more important to be in person with your family. Mm-hmm. And now when I think about all these conferences and stuff that I used to go to all the time, a lot of them are happening virtually, and that's way better. I mean, it's not quite as good, they're not quite as impactful, but now all of a sudden there's 100 people that didn't have to leave their family for 2 or 3 days. And that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. As well as the ecological benefit.
Yes. Yeah. There's not as many flights, not as many hotel rooms, there's the cost of getting a big team together in person is it's astronomical, really. Not just, and it's, paying for the flights and the hotels is the least of it. What we do to the planet, what we do to the families of people are intense. So I think really remembering to have, it's easy. It's also easy, like with my husband, especially when we have twins and when they were young, it was so easy to just never talk to each other, never to sit down and have a real conversation. And remembering to do that every day is important.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, question number 9. Aside from compound interest, what's the most important or useful thing you've learned about money?
Money is the lack of poverty is bad, but money is not good, right? It's kind of a net negative. So for me, the important thing about money, that probably the most important decision I made about money happened when I was in business school, and I saw people were on this, what I call the hedonic, I didn't come up with this, but I love this term, the hedonic treadmill. Like they were never going to have enough money, and no matter how much money they made. And I realized that I made myself a really solemn promise. I said, once I have bought a house and I can pay for my kids' education, then I'm done. I'm not going to do things for money. And in fact, when I started writing Radical Candor, I walked away from a job that was, where the equity was worth a lot of money. And people didn't believe that I was walking away from that job to write a book, which was not going to make, it's been a great ride, but the book did not make me a lot of money. And I decided to do it because I had this dream that I'd always thought, well, I'll write in the future, I'll write later. And I had this dream that I had gotten early onset Alzheimer's and that it was too late for me to write the book. And I realized I got to, this is what I want to do. Why am I going to stick around for the money? My husband and I have bought our house, we've put money aside for college. And so I got to walk away. I got to do what I really want to do.
Well, good for you for actually doing that.
Yeah, you've got to manage your money. Don't let your money manage you.
Yeah, that's great. Well, speaking of money, something I have done in an attempt to demonstrate my gratitude to you for making time to talk with me today is I have, through kiva.org, I have made a microloan to a woman named Zazira who lives in Kyrgyzstan. I've made a $100 microloan to help her buy dairy cows, which she will then milk and sell the milk and improve the quality of life for people in her community, herself, her family. She's 40 years old with 6 children, and she's raising livestock for 12 years. So,
wow. Well, thank you. That's a meaningful gift. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, congratulations. You survived the enlightening lightning round.
Excellent.
So the last part here is just a few questions about writing and creativity. Where I'd love to start is I understand you have I don't know if you call yours a she shed. I know some people do. Yeah. Do you call it that?
No, I call it the glass house, but it's a little box in the backyard.
Tell me about that.
So when I was writing Just Work, I was writing in my bedroom. And I was writing a lot about gender injustice. And I finally said to Andy, my husband, I was like, this is the wrong place to be writing this book. I need a space that's outside of the house. And so we started building. We basically got 3 sliding glass doors from Home Depot and worked with this great contractor, Mike Turkington. I give him thanks, actually, and the acknowledgement of Just Work, because I never would have finished the book. And we built this kind of shack in the backyard. And it's got a great view looking out over Silicon Valley. And it turned out, we started it before COVID, but it turned out so important during COVID that I could have a place. It was like a room of one's own. I had a place where I could go and focus. It was wonderful. I love that. I'm not there now because the acoustics aren't very good. But it was really a creative, generative space for me. Yeah. And my favorite part about it is at the end of the day, when dinner was ready, my kids would blow the trumpet they were playing the trumpet. And that was my sign that my workday was over. It was time to come down.
That is really cool. That's fantastic. And I understand. Well, let me ask you this instead for now. Do you think that writers are born? Like, are we born a writer? And if we're just not, we're kind of doomed to never actually be a writer? Or can anyone be a writer?
I think anyone can be a writer. The question is, do you enjoy writing? I think, and it's almost not even, do you enjoy writing, but like, does it really, for me, writing is restorative. And I love it. I would, I've written several unpublished novels. I'm writing another novel. Hopefully it'll get published. But even when I was writing Radical Candor, I was writing it because I needed to write it. Why I needed that, I can't tell you. But I don't think there's so many different ways to be creative, and you want to find the way that works for you. I mean, with all things in life, it's like you don't necessarily want to do the things that other people think you're good at. You want to do the things that give you comfort and strength. And so for me, writing is that thing.
I think even among writers, not just among people, but among writers, I do think I just learned yesterday, unique. If you're going to use unique, it really does mean singular. So I won't say you're unique in this regard, but you're rare in that writing is restorative for you. Because most of my guests, when I ask about the writing process, they will confirm my suspicion that writing never really gets easier or even more enjoyable. Our writing, the quality of it might improve with practice, but for many people, writing seems depleting, kind of the Hemingway, oh, it's easy. You just sit down at the keys and bleed, kinds of thing. Yeah. But it sounds like that's not your experience. It is actually somehow fulfilling.
It's fulfilling, but I think that doesn't mean it's easy, right? I mean, it's interesting when I was really, especially for me, the part that there's different writers who find different parts of the process easier and harder. For me, the first draft is the most fun part. That's the part editing is actually work. Editing does not, but all of it is for me really, I find that it is the opportunity to root around in my own mind and sort of have these arguments with myself and figure out what I believe is really rewarding in a way that few other things are. And that's the second hardest part of writing for me, is getting inside my own head. The hardest part is getting back out. And that's the editing part. And that's where I need editors. And with both of my books, I had more than 100 collaborators in the Google Doc that I wrote. So I really value getting sort of thoughts and reactions from other people. That's how I clamor back out of my own head.
That's really cool. I had the opportunity a few years ago to develop a presentation at the time we had about 10,000 employees, and we wrote a script. We started with a brief and wrote a script and all this. And I think I had a microcosmic version of your experience where I didn't have 100 collaborators, but I had maybe a dozen. And I remember being so proud of looking back at that 45-minute presentation that was hundreds of hours of work collectively, and recalling specific lines that were this discussion or that came from that person. And it was really a neat experience.
Yeah. Coming back to the very beginning of our conversation, it is sort of making your dreams come true and melding your dreams with others. And it's a really cool experience.
Yeah, I think this is part of the magic of filmmaking, quite honestly.
Yeah.
That it is so collaborative and people can be involved in different ways, but they're all working toward one result and things. It's neat.
Yeah.
Who has been influential for you in your development as a writer, and what have you learned from them?
George Eliot. So I mostly read novels. I find that novels are a great way to understand myself and also other people. And so one of the great novelists of all time, I think, is George Eliot, or Marianne Evans Cross was her real name. Virginia Woolf is another writer who I love. Toni Morrison. When I was in college, I got to take a class with Toni Morrison.
Wow.
And I had already read a number of her books, and her writing had a big impact on me. And she also encouraged us to sort of reconsider a canonical American literature. She has a great book actually called Playing in the Dark, I think it's called, about sort of reinterpreting sort of American, Moby Dick, etc., American literature. And I learned so much from her, and language, and how to identify these voices in your head that are getting in your way. So very, very grateful for that experience.
Mm.
I also I love reading Jung and Viktor Frankl, and there's Karen Horney's Neurosis and Human Growth. Some of these psychological texts had a big impact on me.
Right on. How connected do you feel to the reader in the moment of drafting?
I think that's part of the reason why it's so important to get other people to comment. Mm-hmm. I really try to understand how what I'm trying to say might get misinterpreted or interpreted differently. It's, for me, the reader, the whole reason to write and to edit more specifically. If I were just going to write for myself, I would always stick with that first draft.
Right.
But the reason to edit is to help other people. I want my ideas to have a difference, to make a difference. I want to make those dreams real in the world. And so writing for readers, there's always hopefully a diverse set of readers in my head. But I remember there was one experience I had when a young woman came up to me right after I'd given a talk about radical candor. And she said, I became a manager for the first time. She said it was really hard, and her eyes filled with tears. I could tell it had been seriously hard. And then she said, and then I read Radical Candor, and I felt like I had a sister with me who could help me. And that was like one of the all-time great moments of my career. Similarly with Just Work, I got a note from a guy who had been one of the early engineers who worked on Lotus 1, 2, 3, and one of too few Black engineering leaders in tech. And he was raised in Oakland, California. And he said, I never imagined that I could have so much in common with a white woman from the South. And that was like, yes, I did something there. And so those are the kinds of moments that really, are fuel for the next book. Yeah,
that's awesome. What happens in routines serve you well, or which ones have you tried and it didn't really work for you? You kind of abandoned or just left behind?
Yeah, the thing that is helpful for me, when I first started writing, I would try to have these 4-hour blocks of time. And 2.5 of those hours were always wasted. I cannot focus for that long. Mm-hmm. So the routine that works for me is to write for an hour and a half and then take a walk, and then write for an hour and a half and then maybe have lunch, and then write for an hour and a half and then have a meeting. And if I have energy left, I'll do another hour and a half. But sometimes I just don't. And not pushing myself beyond my limit, like allowing myself the freedom to take a walk or, watch a TV show or whatever I need to do to rest and recover.
Yeah. What tools do you find invaluable as a writer?
Google Documents is because the collaboration is so easy that it is, and being able to have what sort of document centric chat, like there's a paragraph and one person will say one thing and another person will say another thing, and it's all right there. It's really helpful for me in writing. In writing is the collaborative aspect of it is much easier.
How do you organize once you've got your table of contents or your outline kind of figured out and you feel good about it? How do you draw upon the research you've conducted, like stories you think you might want to include, and then you know where to go to find them or develop them, or statistics or other things? How do you pull all of that into the framework you've created?
I have a pretty chaotic process, which is I don't usually start with the table of contents. And in fact, sometimes I get to one and I realize it's all off. In fact, with Just Work, I wrote 80,000 words and threw it away and started again because I realized the structure was wrong. It's funny. I was talking to my agent who's like, why can't you just like write your outline and write the book? I'm like, well, if I knew the outline, then I wouldn't need to write the book. Like to me, the writing, the structure comes out of the writing. And so it's a messy process.
Interesting.
Not very linear.
Yeah. That just confirms for me this other suspicion that, there really is no one size fits all approach. It's just what works for us.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the challenges. It's one of the joys sometimes too, of discovering, ourselves a little bit, the tools and the routines and things like that. Okay. So last couple questions here, and then we'll wrap. What are the qualities of a great sentence, and how can we write more of them?
I think a great sentence does a couple of things. A great sentence helps the reader feel the way that the writer is feeling. It tells like a little story. But a great sentence also offers up kind of a way to think about that story, a framework. And I think very often when a sentence really packs a great punch, it's communicating both on that intellectual plane and that emotional plane at the same time, succinctly, as short as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So my last question for you here is just what advice or encouragement would you offer to anyone who's listening, who's either in the messy middle of getting their own book across the finish line, or it's a dream they've had for a long time, but they haven't actually begun? What do you say to that person?
The thing that helped me write probably more than anything else was just blocking a couple of writing blocks in my calendar every day and treating that meeting almost like a sacred thing that I was doing. I told my assistant at one point when I was writing a novel when I worked at Google, and I had a writing block in the morning and a writing block in the late afternoon. And I told my assistant, those are my meetings with God. You cannot schedule over them.
Wow.
And treating it like a sacred thing. But also doing the mundane thing of putting it in your calendar was for me the most helpful thing.
All right. That reminds me of Gavin Edwards. He wrote a book about like lessons from Mr. Rogers, kindness and so forth.
Yeah.
And I just always remember he talked about this is like, in some ways, writing is like building a brick wall. That it really is. Words are like these bricks, and we just lay them. And then I love that same teacher, Stephen Cope, that I mentioned earlier. He talked about his work is to suit up and show up. So it's one thing to have the appointment with God, but it's another to show up for it. And good for you that you have it. Good for us. Well, Kim, I've really enjoyed this. I did enjoy reading your book. It challenged me in many good ways. I've enjoyed this conversation. I've been inspired by your leadership. This is one thing I love about what I know of you. You're not just some theoretician, if that's a word. It reminds me, right? You probably heard this in theory and practice. There's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is.
Yes.
Right. But you are drawing upon a rich history, like a rich experience of leadership. And I know I began kind of with Sergio, but I just want to maybe end with this too, of He told me that of a team of about 100 people that you led, that you met with every single one of them one-on-one every quarter.
I did. Well, there was the thing that I loved about the job. And once the team grew to 700, I could no longer do that anymore, but which was hard for me to come to grips with. But it was so important for me to really, at a personal level, get to know people and not that you're going to get to know people deeply and short one-on-one meetings, but to understand, to give them an opportunity to tell me what was bugging them. Like what was wrong, and what can I do to help make it right?
Yeah, and he's probably told you this, or at least I hope he has. And he and I talk about this, and he writes and shares. So I don't think I'm betraying a confidence. Sorry, Sergio, if I am. I trust you'll forgive me. He told me that growing up in Poland, his view of leadership was that it was very authoritarian, it was distant, it was cold, and that as a 23 or 24-year-old. Coming to the United States, working for Google and seeing your example taught him that of what leadership can be. And that is part of the work he's doing now with these underrepresented and underserved entrepreneurs and making a difference, a big difference, I think, in the world. And so I think that's pretty cool. And for what it's worth, I just want to thank you for that as well.
Well, I thank him. It was so. Those AdSense years were really special years in my career, and they were special because of all the people on that team who were all of them equally committed to making sure that we created the kind of culture where we did care personally and challenge directly, where we really did support one another.
That's awesome. All right, Kim. Well, please keep up the good work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our paths will cross again, but I will look forward to it when they do.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the School for Good Living podcast. Before you take off, I just want to extend an invitation to you. Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life still isn't working for many people. Whether it's here in the developed world where we deal with depression, anxiety, loneliness, addiction, divorce, unfulfilling jobs or relationships that don't work, or in the developing world where so many people still don't have access to basic things like clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or they live in conflict zones, there are a lot of people on this planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, or even if your life is working, but you have the sense that it could work better, consider signing up for the School for Good Living's transformational coaching program. It's something I've designed to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated, or you've gone through a divorce, or you've gotten married, headed into retirement, starting a business, been married for a long time, whatever. No matter where you are in life, this 9-month program will give you the opportunity to go deep in every area of your life, to explore life's big questions, to create answers for yourself in a community of other growth-minded individuals. And it can help you get clarity and be accountable to realize more of your unrealized potential. It can also help you find and maintain motivation. In short, it's designed to help you live with greater health, happiness, and meaning so that you can be, do, have, and give more. Visit goodliving.com to learn more or to sign up today.